My mother grabbed the bank passbook from my hands and threw it in the trash before I could even ask what it was. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about money. It was about something she was desperate to keep buried. My name is Marianne Holt. I'm a paralegal, and I thought I understood paperwork and family secrets until I realized the person I trusted most had been stealing from my grandfather for years, and the one thing she never found was the account that proved everything. Chapter 1: The Passbook That Made My Mother Lose Control. I was 36 years old when I learned how quickly a family can turn quiet when something it wants to hide comes too close to the surface. I worked as a paralegal in Columbus, Ohio. Not a lawyer, not someone with power, just someone who read documents for a living and learned how people told the truth by accident. My job trained me to notice pauses, incomplete sentences, the way hands moved when someone thought no one was watching. It did not train me for my own family. The Holt family had always been polite. That was the word people used. Polite. We showed up on time, we said thank you, we avoided anything that sounded like conflict. Underneath that polish, there was very little warmth. My mother, Elaine Holt, ran our family the way she ran her house. Everything had a place, everything was decided in advance. Questions were not encouraged. My older brother, Brian Holt, understood that instinctively. He stayed close to her. He agreed quickly. He let her speak first and nodded at the right moments. I learned early that being the quieter one made things easier. You do not argue with someone who thinks order is the same thing as love. My grandfather, Walter Hale, died in early spring at 88. He lived outside Columbus in a modest house he had owned since the 70s. He was a retired accountant who still balanced his checkbook by hand long after computers took over. He liked chess. He liked routine. He trusted paper more than people. The funeral was held on a gray Tuesday morning. Everything ran on schedule. The service started exactly on time. The minister spoke for exactly the length Elaine had requested. No one lingered, no one cried out loud. There were handshakes and nods and murmured comments about traffic and weather. It felt less like a goodbye and more like a task that needed to be completed efficiently. Elaine handled everything. She stood near the front with a small black notebook tucked under her arm. She directed the funeral home staff. She corrected the spelling of names. She reminded the minister which hymn Walter had preferred. Not once did she mention him by name. Not once did she speak about who he had been. She spoke only about arrangements. On the drive back to his house, she talked about next steps, about paperwork, about listing the property, about how quickly things could move if we did not get bogged down in sentiment. It sounded practical. It always did with her. I told myself not to read into it. After lunch, Brian helped carry chairs back into the garage. Elaine went straight to the study. I wandered through the house slowly, touching familiar objects. Walter had not owned much. A few framed photographs, a clock that ticked too loudly, shelves of books he never threw away. The study smelled faintly of dust and old paper. His desk was cleared except for a lamp and a wooden chessboard. On the shelf behind it sat a row of books he had owned for decades. I reached for the chessbook without thinking. It was heavier than it should have been. When I opened it, the center had been hollowed out with careful precision. Inside sat a small, worn passbook, its cover cracked at the corners. It looked old, out of place, like something that had survived on purpose. I stood there longer than I needed to, not because I thought I had found money. I did not think that at all. I stood there because it felt deliberate, because Walter was deliberate about everything. I brought it into the living room where Elaine was stacking folders on the coffee table. I did not announce it. I simply held it out and asked what it was. The reaction was instant and sharp. Elaine lunged forward and grabbed it from my hands. Her face changed in a way I had never seen. Her jaw tightened. Her voice rose. She told me that did not matter, that it was nothing, that I had no business digging through his things. Before I could respond, she walked to the kitchen and threw it into the trash. The lid slammed shut. She turned back and told me not to touch anything else. She said it with the kind of authority that made people obey without realizing they were doing it. Brian stood near the doorway. He did not say anything. He did not look surprised. He did not ask what the book was. He met Elaine's eyes for half a second and then looked away. It was not a look of confusion, it was recognition. The room went quiet in that strained way that follows an outburst no one wants to acknowledge. Elaine smoothed her hair, she picked up her notebook, she resumed talking about timelines and contractors and estate attorneys as if nothing had happened. I nodded. I listened. I told myself it was grief. I told myself everyone reacts differently, but the feeling in my chest would not settle. I was not thinking about money. I was thinking about reaction. In my work, I had learned that people who have nothing to hide do not panic when you ask simple questions. They explain, they redirect, they reassure. They do not grab, they do not throw things away. I kept glancing at the kitchen, at the trash can tucked beside the counter. Elaine noticed and closed the lid with her foot. The gesture was small, final. That night, Brian left early. Elaine stayed to sort through drawers. I offered to help, and she told me no. She said she had it handled. She said it twice. When I finally went upstairs to the guest room, I did not sleep. The house creaked the way old houses do. The clock in the hallway ticked. My thoughts kept circling back to Walter, to the way he had always insisted on keeping records, to the way he never trusted memory alone. Sometime after midnight, I went downstairs for water. The kitchen light cast a dull yellow glow. The trash can sat exactly where it had been earlier. I stood there longer than I want to admit, arguing with myself, telling myself not to be dramatic, telling myself this was not my place. In the end, I lifted the lid. The passbook sat on top, untouched. Elaine hadn't even tried to hide it. I took it out and held it in my hands. It felt heavier now, not physically, in every other way. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded piece of paper. Walter's handwriting was careful and precise, the way it always had been. He wrote that they didn't know about this, that I should ask for the full history, that I should trust no one in the family, only me. I closed the book and sat at the kitchen table until the sun began to rise. By morning, nothing had changed in the house. Elaine acted as though the previous day had never happened. Brian texted to ask if I was still staying another night. I told him I was heading back to Columbus. As I packed my bag, I placed the passbook at the bottom, wrapped in a sweater. I did not feel excited. I felt unsettled. For the first time in my life, I wondered if the man I thought was simply quiet had been watching all along, and whether the silence in our family had always been less about peace and more about control. I did not know yet what I would do with what I had found. I only knew that whatever it was not meant to disappear quietly. Chapter 2. Everyone told me to let it go. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex in Columbus, the sky was still gray and my hands felt stiff on the steering wheel. I carried my bag upstairs, locked the door behind me, and set the passbook on my kitchen table like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for this moment. Walter's note was folded small and pressed flat. Trust no one in the family, only you, Marianne. I read it again, slower this time, as if the words might change if I gave them another chance. Walter Hale was not a man who dramatized anything. He balanced ledgers for 40 years and believed facts were kinder than opinions. If he wrote a warning like that, it meant he had already tried every quiet way out. I did what my job trained me to do. I documented. I took pictures of the note, the account page, the inside cover. I emailed the images to myself. I saved them in a folder with a boring name so no one would notice. Then I slid the paper note into my wallet instead of leaving it in the passbook, because something in me no longer trusted the idea of a safe place. My phone rang before I had even made coffee. Elaine Holt. I answered with a neutral voice. She asked if I got home safely, the soft version of her that sounded like a mother. Then she asked if I had taken anything from Walter's house that belonged with the estate paperwork. I told her I only took my bag. Elaine said she was doing a final sweep of the house and wanted to keep everything organized. She mentioned old bank items, she mentioned family records. She said the passbook should stay with the estate documents so nothing got lost. I asked why it mattered. She said it did not. She said it was outdated and confusing. She said I did not want to get tangled in something I did not understand. She reminded me she was handling the estate, and I needed to trust her to do it correctly. Trust her. The words landed with the familiar weight of a door closing. I did not argue. I did not confirm what I had. I let the conversation end the way she wanted, because I was already learning that the safest place to keep a secret was inside a calm voice. A few hours later, Brian Holt called. He started with small talk, asked about work, asked if I slept. His tone was easy, like he was already smoothing the surface before he touched the bruise. Then he said Mom told him I found something in Walter's study. He said Walter kept odd junk. He said Elaine was stressed and I should not take her reaction personally. I asked why she threw it away. Brian laughed once, a short sound that did not reach his eyes even though I could not see him. He said she did not throw it away, she just didn't want it lying around. He said families tore themselves apart over misunderstandings. He used the word drama the way people used it when they wanted you to feel ashamed for asking a question. He told me there was no need to involve outsiders. He told me banks treated people like criminals. He told me not to make things bigger than they had to be. When he hung up, I sat at my table and felt my chest tighten. Neither of them asked what Walter wrote. Neither of them sounded surprised a passbook existed. They were not curious, they were managing. The next day at work, I tried to hide my distraction behind routine. I organized files, I drafted letters, I read through records and highlighted facts like I always did, because facts were steady and my family was not. At lunch, I stayed at my desk. Denise, a senior paralegal who had seen every kind of mess, stopped by with a folder and looked at my face a little too long. She asked if I was okay. I told her my grandfather died and there was tension with my mother about paperwork. I kept it vague, hoping her reaction would tell me if I was overreacting. Denise sighed. She said family and money brought out the worst. Then she said my mother was still my mother. She said sometimes it was better to let things go. She said peace was worth more than being right. I nodded because that was what polite people did. Inside, something hardened. Peace had always meant my silence. Peace had always meant Elaine got to decide what was real. That evening, Elaine texted that she would stop by Saturday morning. She said she needed my signature on a simple form confirming I had collected any personal belongings I wanted from Walter's home, so the house could be listed without delays. The message was written like a formality. My stomach still dropped. I knew what kind of paper did. It closed options. It made later questions look like a change of story. It turned uncertainty into consent. Saturday morning, Elaine arrived exactly on time. She wore a neat coat and carried a manila envelope as if it were proof of good intentions. She stepped into my apartment, complimented my place, asked if I was eating enough, then placed the envelope on my table and slid one sheet toward me with a pen. I read the form slowly. It was short and clean. It stated I had removed any personal items I wished to keep from Walter's property and had no further claim to the contents. Elaine watched me read. She said it's standard. She said the realtor needed it. She said the estate attorney recommended keeping everything clean. I asked why she needed my signature. Elaine's smile tightened. She said Walter was gone and we are not dragging this out. She said it's time to move on. She said I always made things harder than they had to be. I asked her what happened to the passbook. Elaine blinked quickly as if she had to choose a face. She said she threw it away because it was useless and confusing, and she didn't want me fixating on it. She said it was a distraction. I set the pen down. I told her I was not signing anything today. The air changed. Elaine's voice sharpened. She said I was being difficult. She said I was making accusations. She said if I took something from Walter's house, I needed to return it. She said decent families did not keep secrets from each other. I stood up and handed the pen back to her. I told her I needed time to read everything carefully. I told her I wanted the estate attorney to explain it to me. I watched her flinch at the word attorney, even though she loved legal language when it served her. Elaine gathered the papers and stood. She said fine, she would handle it without me, and she hoped I could live with the consequences of delaying things. At the door, she turned back and her voice softened into something that sounded like concern. She told me not to do anything stupid. She told me not to go poking around at the bank. She said they would treat me like a thief if I showed up with something that wasn't mine. After she left, my legs felt weak. She had not threatened me directly, but the warning was clear. Stay quiet, stay in line, let it go. I sat on my couch until my breathing steadied. Then I walked to my closet, pulled the passbook from where I had hidden it, and held it in both hands. If there was truth in this, I could not keep letting my family decide what I was allowed to know. Elaine called it peace. I felt it for what it was, erasure. I requested Monday off work and said it was for family matters, which was true. I packed a small bag, checked my car, and printed directions like I was heading into any normal day. Before dawn on Monday, I got in my car and started driving toward Marietta, Ohio, the bank name on the passbook sitting in my mind like a locked door I couldn't stop myself from reaching for. Chapter 3. The bank manager didn't smile back. The road was empty as I crossed the Muskingum River and followed the signs into Marietta, the town still half asleep under a low sky. I parked across the street from the bank listed on the passbook and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the wheel. The building looked harmless, brick and glass, an American flag stirring lightly by the door. Nothing about it suggested secrets or betrayal. That was what made my chest tighten. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. A single teller window was open. An older couple filled out deposit slips at a small counter. I waited my turn, the passbook tucked into my bag like something fragile. When I reached the counter, I slid it across and asked if someone could tell me about the account. The teller was polite, practiced. She flipped through the pages, typed into her computer, then paused. Her smile softened into something careful. She asked me to take a seat. I chose a chair near the window and watched the minute hand on the clock crawl forward. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The older couple left. The lobby grew quieter. I began to wonder if Elaine was right, if I had misunderstood, if this would end with an apology and a polite dismissal. A man in a dark jacket approached and asked my name. He did not smile. He asked me to follow him down a short hallway to a small office with frosted glass. Inside, he gestured for me to sit and closed the door gently. He introduced himself as Thomas Caldwell, regional manager. His voice was steady, but his eyes did not quite meet mine. He said they had located the account tied to the passbook. He said there were some irregularities that required care. He asked how I was related to the account holder. I told him Walter Hale was my grandfather. Caldwell nodded once and folded his hands. For a moment, he seemed to be choosing his words. Then he said something that made the room feel smaller. The person who tried to access this account is someone you trust. I felt my pulse jump. I asked what he meant. He said before he explained, he needed to be clear that what he was about to share could be upsetting. He asked if I wanted water. I shook my head. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. Lines of text filled the screen. Dates, numbers, notes written in a clinical tone. He said the account was opened in 2011, not decades ago, not forgotten, opened deliberately. He said the passbook was designed to look old, but the account itself was not. He said it was what some clients chose when they wanted privacy without drawing attention. I asked how much was in it. Caldwell hesitated, then said the balance as of the end of 2024 was approximately $2.38 million. He said it calmly, like he was reading the weather. My mouth went dry. I had not come for money. I had come for answers. Still, the number landed hard. He continued before I could speak. He said the account had never been accessed successfully. No withdrawals, no transfers, just interest accumulating quietly over time. Then he said in 2016, someone attempted to access it using a power of attorney. The request had been flagged. The signature did not match the records on file. The attempt was denied. I asked who made the attempt. Caldwell looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was gauging whether I was about to break, and said the name. Elaine Holt. The room tilted slightly. I pressed my hands together under the desk to keep them from shaking. I asked how that was possible. He explained carefully. He said the attempt in 2016 was specific to this account. He said prior to that, and in parallel, there were other accounts tied to Walter Hale at different institutions, smaller balances, routine activity. From 2012 through 2019, funds were withdrawn steadily under a valid power of attorney. On paper, everything looked authorized. He paused and added that authorization did not always mean ethical. He used terms that felt heavy and precise: elder financial abuse, fraud, paper trail. He explained that patterns mattered more than single transactions. He explained that this account stood out because it was untouched, protected, and because someone tried to break into it and failed. I stared at the screen, at the neat rows of data, and felt a cold understanding spread through me. Walter had not been a victim waiting to be rescued. He had been a man playing a long game, trusting that truth would surface eventually. And for the first time, it felt like the system might be listening. My phone buzzed with a message from Elaine, a single line asking how my day was going. I did not answer. I drove out of town as the sun climbed higher, knowing that whatever came next, it was no longer something my family could erase quietly. Chapter 4. My grandfather had been waiting years. I did not go straight home after leaving Marietta. I drove until the roads blurred together, until the weight in my chest settled into something colder and steadier. By the time I turned back toward Columbus, I knew one thing clearly. Whatever Walter had done, he had not done it out of fear. He had done it with intention. The next name on the list was Edward Linwood. Walter had mentioned him only a handful of times over the years, always in passing. Ed helped with paperwork. Ed knew where things were kept. Ed understood how Walter thought. I found his number in an old address book tucked into the Passbook cover, written in the same careful handwriting as the note. Edward Linwood's office sat in a narrow brick building not far from downtown. It smelled faintly of leather and dust, the kind of place that did not rush anything. When I introduced myself, his expression shifted almost immediately. "So you're Marianne," he said. He did not ask why I was there. He already knew. We sat across from each other at a long table scarred with decades of use. Edward moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp. He folded his hands and studied me for a moment before speaking again. "Walter was worried about you," he said quietly. "Not in the way people worry when they panic, in the way they worry when they plan." I told him about the bank, about the passbook, about my mother. Edward nodded as if pieces were sliding into place. Then he opened a file drawer and pulled out a thick folder, heavier than I expected. "Walter started noticing money missing in 2012, he said. "Small amounts at first, nothing dramatic, the kind of thing people explain away." He slid a sheet across the table. Dates, numbers, notes in Walter's handwriting. Edward explained that between 2012 and 2019, funds were withdrawn from several accounts under a valid power of attorney. On paper, it all looked clean. Elaine Holt had authority. The banks followed procedure. No one flagged it as abuse because nothing tripped the alarms. But Walter knew his own finances, he said. He knew what should have been there. I asked why no one listened to him. Edward's mouth tightened. He said once Elaine began managing Walter's care, she framed everything as concern. Forgetfulness, confusion, stress. She suggested evaluations. She spoke for him in meetings. Slowly, his objections were treated like symptoms instead of warnings. By 2011, Edward said, Walter had already taken precautions. That was when he opened the separate account, the one disguised behind the old passbook. He moved a portion of his assets quietly, legally, without announcing it to anyone. He told me that some people do not steal everything at once. They take what they think they deserve and leave the rest behind, assuming no one will notice. Walter kept records, copies of statements, notes about conversations, dates when Elaine redirected mail. He stored duplicates with Edward and kept the originals hidden in places he knew Elaine would never search. I felt something twist inside me. This was not a confused old man. This was someone watching his own family betray him in slow motion and choosing patience over confrontation. Edward closed the folder and looked at me. He asked me to wait. He believed that if he acted too soon, everything would disappear. I asked about Brian. Edward exhaled slowly. He said Brian Holt formed Holt Asset Solutions LLC in 2014, a shell company, clean on the surface. Between 2015 and 2019, approximately $640,000 passed through it. Consulting fees, investment transfers, money that originated from accounts tied to Walter Hale. Did Brian know where it came from? I asked. Edward did not answer immediately. Then he said he never asked the questions someone innocent usually asks. That was enough. I left Edward's office with copies of everything Walter had saved, my hands shaking for a different reason now. The truth was no longer abstract. It was documented. It had weight. Elaine called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. Brian texted that we needed to talk. I did not respond. 2 days later, Elaine showed up at Walter's house with boxes. I arrived just as she was loading the back of her car. Old files, loose papers, framed photos. She froze when she saw me. "What are you doing here?" she asked, too quickly. "I could ask you the same thing," I said. Elaine said she was cleaning. She said the house needed to be prepared for sale. She said it was time to let go of clutter. I asked her about the power of attorney. Her expression shifted, the practiced calm slipping. She said of course she had one. She said Walter trusted her. She said everything she did was for his benefit. I asked about the missing money. Elaine's voice sharpened. She said I was imagining things. She said I had always been dramatic. She said I was projecting my own financial insecurities onto her. Brian stepped in then, standing a little behind her shoulder. "Marianne, stop. This is getting out of hand. You're making accusations without understanding the full picture." I asked him about Holt Asset Solutions. He did not deny it. He did not explain it either. He just said, "This doesn't need to become a spectacle." That was when I understood. Silence was not neutrality. It was collaboration. Elaine started pulling files from drawers and dropping them into boxes without looking. Old tax records, correspondence, anything dated more than a few years back. I stepped forward and told her to stop. She laughed once, sharp and brittle. "You don't get to control this," she said. "You never have." That night, I called Edward and asked him to help me secure copies of everything before it disappeared. We worked quickly, scanning, backing up, labeling. Every document Walter had saved was duplicated and stored away. Within a week, the full file was ready. Edward sent it to the appropriate authorities, financial crimes, compliance, the kind of people who read patterns instead of listening to stories. When it was done, I sat alone in my apartment and felt the weight of it settle. There was no going back now, no way to pretend this was a misunderstanding. The truth had been moved out of the shadows and placed into hands that would not let it be ignored. Walter had waited years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, there was nothing left for me to do but stand still and let the consequences begin.
Chapter 5. Some doors close for a reason.
The months after everything was turned over to the authorities felt strangely empty at first, like the pause after a long-held breath. I had spent so much time reacting, documenting, answering questions, that when no one needed anything from me for a while, I did not know what to do with the quiet. In early 2024, the call finally came. A woman from the Financial Crimes Unit introduced herself, her voice calm and unhurried. She said my name carefully, as if testing it for weight. She asked if I was willing to answer some follow-up questions regarding Walter Hale's estate and the records I had provided. I said yes before she finished explaining. We met in a small government office with neutral walls and fluorescent lighting. A recorder sat on the table between us. She asked about dates, about conversations, about how often Elaine spoke for Walter when others were present. She asked whether Walter had ever complained directly to me. I answered as clearly as I could. I stayed with facts. Years of legal work had taught me that emotion could blur memory, but documents did not. After that meeting, the process moved forward whether I watched it or not. Subpoenas were issued, banks were contacted, records were pulled from places Elaine assumed no one would ever look. Each time I was asked for something, I provided it. Then I went back to my life and waited again. Elaine was charged in the fall of that year: elder financial abuse, fraud, forged documents. The words were formal, almost sterile, but they carried consequences that could not be softened. There was no dramatic arrest, no confrontation. She was simply removed from the position of control she had occupied for so long. For the first time in my life, she was not directing anything. Brian's charges followed soon after: conspiracy, money laundering through Holt Asset Solutions LLC. The company collapsed almost immediately. Clients distanced themselves, accounts froze. The version of him that had always stood confidently behind Elaine vanished with surprising speed. The social fallout was quieter, but just as real. Brian's wife, Sarah, moved out within weeks. Friends who once praised Elaine's devotion stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Familiar faces turned away in public spaces. Reputation, I learned, was not something that could be defended once the truth was written down. Court proceedings began in early 2025. I attended some days and stayed away from others. Sitting in that room was harder than I expected, not because I felt sympathy, but because seeing my family reduced to case numbers stripped away the last illusion that this could have ended differently. Justice did not look like triumph. It looked like paperwork, schedules, and people doing their jobs without emotion. Elaine never looked at me directly. When she did glance my way, her expression was not anger or apology. It was confusion, as if she could not understand how the story had slipped out of her hands. Brian tried once to speak to me in a hallway, saying my name softly like it still carried obligation. I kept walking. There was nothing left to clarify. The verdicts came without ceremony. Elaine was sentenced to several years and ordered to forfeit assets tied to the abuse. Brian received a shorter sentence, but his professional life was effectively over. Restitution was ordered where possible. The account Walter had hidden was returned to the estate exactly as he had intended, untouched, waiting. Edward Linwood called me the afternoon the probate court finalized the will. His voice was steady, almost gentle. "He left everything to you," he said. He was very clear. There were no emotional explanations in the document, no justifications, just a list of instructions written by a man who understood precisely what he was doing. Elaine and Brian were excluded entirely, not out of anger, out of certainty. I sat alone in my apartment after the call and let the weight of it settle. Not the money, the responsibility, the knowledge that Walter had trusted me to protect the truth, not to fix what could not be repaired. I handled the estate carefully. I sold Walter's house and kept only a few things: the chessboard, the book with the hollowed center, his old calculator, the one he refused to replace because it still worked. I did not keep the passbook. It had done its job. Elaine lost more than her freedom. She lost her standing. People who once praised her dedication stopped returning messages. The community she had carefully managed no longer welcomed her version of events. The story moved quietly from one person to another, not as gossip, but as caution. Brian faded from my life completely. Without clients, without credibility, there was nothing left to anchor him. He moved away. No address, no explanation. The distance felt final. I did not celebrate any of it. There was no moment of victory. What I felt instead was space, a quiet that belonged to me. For the first time, I was not managing someone else's comfort. Life settled into something steady. I stayed in my job. I stopped answering calls that carried guilt disguised as concern. I stopped explaining decisions that no longer required approval. Boundaries, I learned, were easier once I understood that I did not need permission to draw them. People sometimes ask if I regret not reconciling, if I wish things had ended differently. I answer honestly. Some doors close because they were never meant to stay open. Peace does not come from pretending nothing happened. It comes from standing still long enough to let the truth pass through without flinching. Walter understood that. He understood that the truth did not need to win quickly. It only needed to survive long enough to be seen. If this story feels familiar, if you have ever been told to let something go for the sake of harmony, know this: you are not alone. There are systems that listen when you speak clearly, and there are paths forward that do not require you to disappear to keep others comfortable. Sometimes the quietest choice is also the strongest one.